Chapter 3, Operation Mockingbird. Do you think the role of news organizations is to remain impartial, to carefully check sources, and to present facts to the public in the service of truth? Would it surprise you to learn, just to throw one name out there for instance, that Phil Gramm, the one-time publisher of the Washington Post, believed that the media's job was to mobilize consent for the policies of the government? Do you agree with his view? With Graham's assistance, the use and manipulation of journalists by the Central Intelligence Agency became a widespread practice. Graham and many others in the media were hired and paid through a CIA program called Operation Mockingbird. The purpose of the program was to manipulate journalists, and through them, their audiences, to support viewpoints favorable to the government. Let me pause for a moment just to interject. Do you think it is ever necessary for a government to fool its own people? Have you found justification for such behavior in the Baha'i writings? I ask this because it seems to me that often individuals and populations reflexively or subconsciously place institutions on a pedestal, assuming that institutions are more important than citizens or not answerable to citizens. Project Mockingbird was eventually discovered and officially investigated by Congress, but it is not clear to me whether this did any good. Beyond the congressional hearings, it seems the general public did not learn much about the sordid affair. Even though the CIA operation known as Project Mockingbird officially came to an end decades ago, the manipulation of news audiences by the intelligence agencies and vested interests continues today and is much more in the open. If you examine conventional news reporting, for instance, you will notice that a great number of their pundits and analysts are, quote, former members of various intelligence agencies. Do you believe that a primary role of true journalists is to advocate for ordinary citizens by holding powerful people and institutions accountable and challenging authority, and, if necessary, publishing unflattering truths that expose wrongdoings? Well, many who work for the most prestigious news organizations don't behave like that at all, points out investigative reporter Glenn Greenwald. Instead, Greenwald says, they act in service of the state or in line with the perspective of generous donors, not challenging those in power, but attacking anyone who does. They repeat the talking points of officials and avoid asking them difficult questions. Greenwald has repeatedly documented this behavior inside the large news organizations. He said, quote, "The journalists who lie most frequently, casually, and aggressively on behalf of the government and economic power centers are the ones who shoot to the top of the corporate journalism ladder." If you follow Greenwald's reporting, you have seen that he provides substantial evidence for these claims for a long list of popular journalists that behave in codependent ways with centers of power and money. If you rely on traditional forms of media, such as television news or the large newspapers, likely you are getting your news from many of these individuals. According to journalists like Glenn Greenwald and Cheryl Atkinson, it sounds like the public's access to truthful information is quite constrained. If that's true, how did we arrive here? Let's go back in time 1 century to examine circumstances that contributed to our current condition. Sigmund Freud was a well-known psychologist whose career was focused on the mind, on understanding behavior and motivation and influences. One of Freud's followers was his own nephew, Edward Bernays, who initially worked as a journalist and press agent, often utilizing insights from Freud's body of work. Bernays was then hired by the U.S. government's Committee on Public Information to influence attitudes in support of U.S. participation in World War I, which Americans had been reluctant to get involved with. Bernays later referred to his efforts as psychological warfare. Bernays is sometimes called the father of public relations. He used Freud's insights to help the government, and later private companies, to control others' minds, to use propaganda and public relations to shift the opinions and the actions of people without their awareness or consent. Bernays, who wrote several books detailing his work, said that manipulating people is an important element in democratic society. Bernays stated that manipulators constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Does this seem like a good idea to you? Hidden elements behind the throne of power influencing the direction of government with no accountability or public awareness? Does this mean that citizens are being misled if they accept at face value the statements that government and media report?